It is so great to see you guys, whether you're joining us in the room today or watching online. Welcome, welcome. My name is Scott DeSanders, the discipleship pastor here at Parkway. And if you're a guest with us today, I'm so excited you're here. I would love to meet you later on. We are in the final week of our I'm Fine series, where we're exploring the difficult emotions that tend to fly under the radar of our more public faces. And we've been asking each week, how are you really doing, right? And it's been interesting over this month. There's been a few times that I've asked somebody, how are you? And they've said, well, actually not great. And it's, first off, a little jarring because we're so used to that just fake I'm fine, but it's been a cool opportunity to have a genuine conversation or a moment of prayer. So I'm really proud of your honesty, Parkway. You're putting in really good work, so keep it up. We know that these difficult emotions can operate like a smoldering fire under the surface, and it can emit just the slightest bit of smoke every now and then at times, but we acknowledge that deeper honesty and vulnerability with each other when we're struggling allows the community that God has given us to care for us and provide His grace and extend His love to us in times of trouble, right? Now, speaking of troubling things, now that we're on this side of Thanksgiving and on this crash course towards Christmas, there's been a disturbing trend out there in the last few years that's really anguished my heart and soul. Have you seen this trend with these whole beard decorations? It's very difficult for me because I could never do this. Like what you see here is what you get. This is all I grow, even at the end of No Shave November. It's pretty unsatisfactory. I'll never be able to grow a full Josh Simone style beard. I could never do something like this. I think marketing would call this an insufficient beard. I just think of it like it is. It's just beard envy. That's what I struggle with. You know that we're talking about envy today, and this is just one of those areas where everywhere I look, all I see is what I can't have. But y'all, this week has had the potential to trigger envy in some other ways for each of us, right? With your Thanksgiving celebrations, did you find yourself potentially looking at other people's experiences with envy? Like maybe it's, well, why did he get the biggest piece of pie? Believe me, I think that. Or everyone loved her cranberries, but no one touched mine. Like, what was wrong with mine? Or maybe I'm seeing people Black Friday shopping, and it occurs to me that maybe my TV isn't big enough, and so I need to invest in something new. Or more seriously, hey, while family is together, maybe it's my sister seems to have everything together with her kiddos. They didn't throw any temper tantrums, and mine were just a wreck. It's embarrassing. Y'all, growing up, for me, sometimes the holidays were a bit of a struggle. I was in a split family, so I would typically spend Thanksgiving in one household with one side of the family, sometimes an awkward mix of blood relatives, step relatives, other folks that I wasn't always excited to be around. And then I'd get to do it all over again a day or two later, sometimes even more awkwardly, or at least I was more awkward about it. As I got older and social media started to become more of a thing in our lives, I grew more and more keenly aware of how much simpler other people seemed to have it. It looked like other people's experiences of the holidays were more straightforward, filled with more warmth, more ease, more comfort. And I grew envious. Things just looked perfect for other people, and it felt to me like it fell so far short of perfect. Did you feel anything like that this week? I think we need to take the time before we go any further to come to an agreed upon understanding of what we mean when we say envy. So let me define it like this. Envy would be a sad or resentful longing that arouses by other people's possessions or luck or qualities or experiences. How's that sound to you? That envy would be a resentful or sad longing arising from other people's possessions or qualities or luck or experiences. Haven't we all felt this at times? Like our first week on anger, envy is similar in that it's a pretty widespread emotion. We all know that we wrestle with it at times, even when we try to mask it or hide it. It's almost like a mold under the surface. Nothing we want others to see, but we can detect it, right? We can tell its presence is there. which also means when we're the ones with a heart clouded by envy, that it's never as invisible to others as we think it should be. And this isn't helped by the fact that our culture around us is working to normalize the experience of envy. Have you seen businesses embracing this concept? You've got sheer envy for hair care. You've got massage envy. There's even a green envy lawn care. It's all an effort to elevate the self, to put ourselves on a pedestal of entitlement and think, I deserve this, I can treat myself. But as collateral damage, we're minimizing the insidious nature and the danger that envy really poses as we allow it greater space in our hearts. There's a medieval theologian and philosopher, Thomas Aquinas, and in the 1200s, he wrote about envy in this way, almost like the categories of Burns. He said there's first degree envy, which is where we just desire to lower the other person or detract from them. This would be thoughts like, well, they didn't do anything to deserve this, or they're so lucky all the time. But then it proceeds to a second stage, a second degree, where we experience joy at their misfortunes or grief at their prosperity. And then it gets worse because the third degree happens where we start to feel hatred that's fueled by sorrow under the surface. Does envy seem harmless now? It can create rifts between us that grow into chasms the more we deny having a problem or neglect addressing it. So whether you're ready to acknowledge it today or would prefer to just write off envy as no big deal, envy truly is a major problem for us, and we all face it to some extent. And God's word shines a light on the severity of the problem. We're going to see that today in the book of Numbers, chapter 11. You're welcome to start turning there. What we're going to see today is we'll look at the root of where envy begins, and then we'll see how it festers and grows within us, and then we will look at the only truly effective way to counteract and combat it. So let's look at Numbers chapter 11. The story of Numbers happens just a little bit before the conquest that we studied in Joshua. We just did that in our previous series, the Seize the Moment series. But Numbers is happening with the people of Israel on the way to the promised land, right? They've already left Egypt in the very well-known Exodus story. But this is in the in-between, that what we would call liminal space, where they're still slowly progressing through the desert wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula. And they're neither here nor there, but God was accompanying them along the way, and there was no doubt to their destination, the land of Canaan, what would later become Israel. But along the way, God's people find themselves in a bit of trouble and in a need of an attitude adjustment. So let's look at the first major component of envy we'll see in Numbers 11, which is this. The root of envy is discontent with what God has given you. Think about that statement. The root of envy, so the foundation of envy, the seed that germinates to become this negative resentment of others, it all begins with a lack of contentment in our hearts. When we fail to recognize the good gifts that God has already given us, and instead we focus on what we don't have, envy is not far behind. So let's see that in our key passage. Numbers 11, the first few verses, tells us, and the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So the name of that place was called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. Okay, so immediately, the first thing we notice here is the people's focus on what? Their misfortunes, right? Their misfortunes. It's almost ironic to think, because this is less than a week after they departed from Mount Sinai, where they had met with the God of the universe. They had received a new covenant and became God's partner people, whom he would develop into a kingdom of priests. This was a climactic, pinnacle experience of Israel's history. And we're talking perhaps 3 days later. Think of like goldfish brain here. They have missed the mark. Also, God has miraculously led them through the early wilderness by cloud and fire, day and night. He's clearly caring for them along the journey. And yet, out of nowhere, they're frustrated. They're tired, probably hungry, thirsty, uncomfortable in the desert wilderness. Did they think they were dying? Maybe. Did they think God had given up on them? Possibly. What we know is they were convinced of their own misfortunes, right? It's pretty common with us, even still today, to think that if we're following God in obedience, we're going to experience nothing but comfort and prosperity, right? But is that how it works? Be honest. Have you in recent times felt like something wasn't going the way you thought it should and then made that mental link to God's not doing his part of the deal? Here's the truth, y'all. We don't earn blessings. Wise choices do not entitle us to everything that we wanted handed to us on a silver platter. God doesn't owe us anything, and yet he still chooses to offer us so much. That's grace defined. And it's sad when we take his good gifts for granted and we focus on what's missing instead. You know the concept of our lot in life? Have you heard of that? Casting lots or even like drawing straws, maybe the modern day version of rock, paper, scissors, right? In biblical terms, it was a way to randomize and leave to chance or God the outcome of an event. So whoever gets one lot versus whoever gets a different lot, that's beyond our control. And we decide we're going to be content with the outcome of this, right? It's not my choice. Biblically, they use this to make big decisions in terms of dividing up priestly tasks or dividing up the land in Joshua. It was also used at times to identify truth. So identifying Jonah as the problem on the boat, right, in the storm. So when we say, along with the famous hymn, whatever my lot, I will say it is well with my soul. We're actually making a statement of contentment, right? We're saying no matter the outcome that I receive, I will still praise the Lord. Y'all, I try to practice this. I think to myself in my own personal life of prayer, God, if this is the lot that you're giving me, I choose to accept it with joy and peace. Because y'all, otherwise, if I think of it in purely human terms, just bad luck, my go-to response is complaining and resentment, just like the Hebrew people. So when Israel looks at their state with negativity and complaint, what happens? We saw it. God's anger is kindled, and rightfully so, right? So he sends a warning throughout the people's camp to the outlying parts. That's where the people got the name for this location, Taberah. It means literally burning. So we're not told that any people were harmed per se, maybe not even in their camp. It could have just been in the brush on the outside of the camp. However it is, it was God getting their attention and saying, hey, your focus is in the wrong place. You're wallowing in a bad attitude. You're missing the enjoyment of the bigger picture that God is up to. Check out what scholar Ron Allen has to say about these verses. He says about the incident at Taberah and what follows that it becomes a dismal record of Israel's acts of ingratitude and of God's consequent judgments on his ungrateful people. Yet within these chapters are innumerable instances of his continuing grace. God could have easily given up on Israel and stopped moving forward with his plan for their future based on their poor attitudes, but he doesn't. It's pretty remarkable. And before we get too critical of the Hebrew people and their goldfish brains, you and I similarly struggle with ungrateful spirits, right? With ingratitude, with discontent. So we need to take the same warning personally. Envious discontent is not just a fleeting, harmless, passing emotion in the moment. It can have a deeper impact on us. Look at what God says in Proverbs 14. He says, a tranquil heart gives life to the flesh, but envy makes the bones rot. What a contrast, right? Rotting bones versus an alive, tranquil heart. That tranquil heart is a picture of contentment, of peace, of God's goodness and grace and providence in our lives. Now, y'all, before we move on, I do want to take a moment to address the difference between discontent and actual grief. It's a different matter, actually, when we're grieving evil that's happened, or tragic loss, or things not being how they should be according to God's created order. This is not the same as resentful, stiff-necked dissatisfaction with God's unfolding plans. In one case, we're aligning our hearts with his in grieving the impact of sin and the fall, noting that the world isn't how it should be, and we're yearning ahead for the new creation to come. But in the other case, we're begrudging the sovereign Lord, and it leads us down a pathway of not trusting his goodness or his plans and what lies to come. When you experience grief or mourning, or even as we discussed last week, depression over things that are legitimately wrong, it doesn't kindle God's anger. More often than not, though, we're on the other side. We're more aligned with the Hebrew people of Numbers 11. We find ourselves complaining of our perceived misfortunes in the midst of a situation of blessing and providence from the hands of a good Father. Now, let's see how envy progresses beyond this initial attitude problem. Second point would be envy is fueled by comparison with what others have. Look at that. Envy is fueled by comparison with what others have. We saw the root of envy, the beginning of things, where discontent lays that foundation for a bad perspective. But now it's actually comparison that adds fuel to the fire, that ends up cranking up the heat of the stove and bringing things to a real boil. You've probably heard this quote attributed to Teddy Roosevelt, that comparison is the thief of joy. And isn't that true in our experience? When we start to focus on our misfortunes, and then we start to add in comparison with this person or that person, it's a dangerous mix. So let's see how it plays out for the Israelites in Numbers 11. Verse 4 tells us, "Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. And the people of Israel also wept again and said, 'Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there's nothing at all but this manna to look at.'" First off, even though the writing here pictures these as separate events with different location names, a lot of scholars really believe that these events happened fairly back to back. So Taberah, what we saw with the burning in their camp, and now this story probably occurred in the same vicinity. So they failed to observe that warning from God, and they kept feeding their poor attitudes now through this trap of comparison. And it's interesting, did you catch how much they're romanticizing their time in Egypt? They're focusing on all these flavor profiles that they had before they went off into the wilderness. The cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and onions and garlic. It's kind of healthy of them, right? They're not like craving Wendy's. They're looking for vegetables, but still. Anyone ever find yourself longing for leeks? Not me. And the fish, right? They're like how easily we could just catch fish freely right from the water. No mind to the fact that one hand is shackled to the embankment. See, they're forgetting that they were slaves in Egypt, right? How could they lose that fact? It's crazy. Maybe their diets had more variety than here in the desert, but they also had to make bricks with no straw. How easy is it for us to misremember the events of the past, or to hold to a skewed, warped estimation of how things maybe were, or how it must be for someone else that we're comparing to? That's what comparison-fueled envy does to us. It causes a break from reality, and we end up believing things that are not accurate. Y'all, true gratitude, the thing that the Hebrew people are severely lacking here, it's rooted in reality, not a fictitious remembrance, not in the warped alternative reality that breeds in our heads when we feed this monster of comparison. And another important detail is right there in verse 6, when they complain, "Our strength is dried up," right? Other translations use the term "our whole being." And so we see that in addition to poor attitudes, they're being a little bit melodramatic too. They're reducing their whole entire lives down to just food, and nothing else matters. Inner strength, resolve, character, nah, that doesn't matter. Faith and trust in following God through the desert, nope. All that matters is filling our bellies. And if that's in jeopardy, if I don't know where that's going to come from, I'm ready to give it all up and turn around. It's rather sad. The people here are prioritizing their preferences over God's provision. So have you ever been guilty of this level of comparison when you've zoomed in on one thing and you've made it the center of the universe and everything else revolves around this? I've definitely struggled with thought processes like this. Whether it's, hey, if only our kids acted like so-and-so's kids, we'd be more successful parents. And before that, it was, if only our marriage was more like theirs, everything would be happier in our household. Before that, it was, if only I was married like all my friends, none of these problems would exist. Or before that, if I had the career success that he had, then I'd get what I truly deserve in life. I'm here to tell you guys, comparison has stolen my joy for too many years. And I'm done with that. I don't want it to hurt my marriage or my family a single day more. So I'm sincerely telling you guys today, I am working at this myself. One more important observation in our passage right here in these verses is that envy is contagious, right? Did you see that? Where did it start? With the rabble, a whiny minority, and then it spread and progressed around the whole camp. And before long, everybody was whining and wailing about how much better things could be. Isn't this still in effect today? Don't you see pressures from media and social networking and just American affluence in general? They make us feel constantly like we need more, like we see things that others have that we don't. Even the people that have the most are still striving for more and influencing others to want more themselves. And so when we occasionally get out of our westernized bubble, we end up seeing a drastic difference in the impact of envy and striving for more. Jesus' church in less affluent cultures ends up putting a higher value on contentment and peace and appreciation for God's good blessings and even a clarity of worship and connection to Him as a result. But y'all, I'm not just picking on American Christians, because envy fueled by comparison has been a problem since the very beginning. It's a tale as old as time. Look back at the start of things, and everywhere in between you see the same thing. Look at Cain killing Abel, right? Jealousy over his brother's worship with God. There was discontent in his own relationship with God, and then comparison with his brother. What about Rachel and Leah and their weird handmaidens and their striving over having kids, right? Envying each other's ability to bear children. It started with a discontent with their outcomes of motherhood and then comparison with each other in this tangled web of competition. What about Saul envying David when he heard all the people singing songs of, remember, Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s, and Saul's envious. And just like Thomas Aquinas says, it doesn't take long for envy to give rise to hateful and murderous intentions. Truly, envy left unbridled and then allowed to fester in comparison is an insidious poison in our heads and in our hearts. So let's continue in our passage. We're going to see some more detail that adds texture to the people's envious rant. Look with me at verse 7. It says, "Now the manna was like coriander seed, and its appearance like that of bdellium. The people went about and gathered it and ground it in hand mills or beat it in mortars, boiled it in pots and made cakes of it. And the taste of it was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. When the dew fell upon the camp in the night, the manna fell with it. And Moses heard the people weeping throughout their clans, everyone at the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord blazed hotly, and Moses was displeased." Remember, the people were fed up with and disgusted with, as they put it, this manna. They'd said in the previous verse, there's nothing at all but this manna to look at. And now the text gives us a little bit more detail. First, the physical description. It describes it as like coriander seed with the appearance of bdellium. It has to have been some kind of granular form. It makes me think of Dippin' Dots, honestly. And then this bdellium is a kind of obscure term for a resin that grows occasionally on Middle Eastern and Asian plants. The first time we hear about manna actually comes in Exodus 16, when God first provides it for the people after leaving Egypt as they're in the desert. He describes it as bread that he's raining down from heaven. And indeed, every morning, the Hebrews would wake up and they would find this granular, edible substance coating the desert floor. It appeared like the morning dew or like frost. So think about that the next time your windshield is fogged up for work in the morning and you're having to scrape it off. Maybe that's what manna was like. I wouldn't eat it though. Scripture describes this manna as tasting like wafers or cakes made with honey, which makes me think of like a little Debbie honey bun. Of course, gathering that out of the desert sand would probably make me complain too. It's important to remember God only gave them enough manna for one day. They were instructed to go out and gather the manna, but just enough to eat for themselves and their family for the day. No more, no less. And we're told that some who stubbornly tried to stockpile up manna for the next day only found it rotting and melting away. In that way, it forced a dependence on and a trust in God. But every day it was there. God provided each and every morning. And reliable food in the middle of the desert, that's nothing to overlook, right? Let's remember, though, by this point in Numbers, the people's time in the wilderness made for about a year-long diet of manna. So I sometimes think of our poor dog and how he eats the same food every meal. No wonder he wants what we're eating, right? And so you might be tempted to empathize with the people here. This was 1 year. They ended up eating manna for 40, so that's quite a bit. Especially if you're a foodie in the room, you're probably horrified at the idea of eating the same thing every day. But it actually strikes me as really essential and remarkable that the manna wasn't anything spectacular. It's not like they woke up to hot fudge sundaes in the desert every morning, right? It was just something ordinary and mundane. Do you see God at work in the mundane? Or is it when things are just blah and normal that you're tempted towards envy and comparison? You see, guys, we're diminishing God's role in providing when we complain. Complaining denies God his full sovereignty because we second guess and we doubt his goodness and his wisdom in knowing what we need. And when we constantly question God, it weakens his greatness in our hearts. That's why I'm so emphatic today about how insidious and dangerous envy can be. In Dante's Divine Comedy, you know, it has the Inferno and Purgatorio and heaven, a fiction. But those struggling with envy, their fate for all eternity is to have their eyes sewn shut with wire to prevent them from looking at others. I know that's a stark image, but there it's a discipline, actually, not a punishment, because ongoing for eternity, they practice generosity and love for others without the distraction of seeing things to compare with. By the end of our passage in Numbers here, we see God's anger burning again at the Hebrew people. It says that his anger blazed hotly. Another usage of that fiery language from earlier in the chapter. And this time it's more serious. We won't read all the way through it, but over the course of the chapter, God actually ends up giving the people the very thing that they're asking for, which is relief from his providence, and he gives them meat. And that same meat takes many of their lives in sickness. Their attitudes of ingratitude and envious complaining proved to be fatal for many people. By the end of the chapter, we see it memorialized. Look at verse 34. It says, therefore, the name of that place was called Kibroth Hatava, because there they buried the people who had the craving. Kibroth Hatava literally means the graves of craving. So the people they buried there died because of their craving for more, because they were not satisfied with the goodness of God, and because they doubted his character. So let's consider ourselves warned like Israel back at the singed camp of Taberah. Even though our God, yes, he is patient and he is long-suffering and full of grace, he still views resentful envy as a matter of life and death. So how do we adequately respond to feelings of envy? Are we meant to just deny it, to try to repress it or push it away and hope that it resolves itself? No. There's a practical way forward, and it's this. The antidote to envy is practicing gratitude and contentment. Gratitude and contentment. These two terms, they run in parallel alignment. As we practice gratitude and as we focus our hearts on the good things that we have been given instead of what we feel is missing, gratitude ends up acting like a balm on our minds, and it creates a healing contentment that settles over and reigns in our hearts. And then we take the time to express that back to God through gratitude. Remember, last week in our discussion of depression, Mark highlighted from Lamentations that God is our portion, and that portion is enough. Remember that? So if our lives are like our plates at Thanksgiving, can you reach a point where you've had enough on your plate and you don't crave more? Let God be your full portion, and you will be satisfied. Israel may have missed the mark here in Numbers 11, and they faced judgment for it. But over time, even they learned to practice gratitude and contentment. So if we fast forward through their wilderness wanderings, once they finally arrived at the promised land, the story of Joshua and the conquest that we looked at in our previous series, when they finally arrived at their forever homes and back in covenant relationship with God, he reminds his people at the end of Joshua this in chapter 24. He says, I gave you a land on which you had not labored and cities that you had not built, and you dwell in them. You eat the fruit of vineyards and olive orchards that you did not plant. And then the people answered, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For it is the Lord our God who brought us and our fathers up from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and who did those great things in our sight and preserved us in all the way that we went and among all the peoples through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out before us all the peoples, the Amorites who lived in the land. Therefore, we also will serve the Lord, for he is our God. Y'all, that's gratitude. Expressing, you are my God and I choose you. And I've seen you provide for me in the past. And I trust that you're going to continue to provide for me in the future. That's practicing gratitude and contentment. It's probably fresh in your memory, but this week, all across America, families practice gathering together and even if just for a moment, expressing thanks back to God. That is the antidote to envy, making a lifestyle out of that very moment where we influence everyone around us to continually practice contentment and gratitude and thanksgiving back to God. So let's wrap this up with some concrete ways to put this into practice, right? How do we make this real and practical in daily life? Let me give you a few. First, limit your engagement with comparison outlets. I know you hear it from us and many other voices, but social media is not your friend when it comes to comparison. It creates a breeding ground for negative comparisons. Maybe I'm not asking you to give up on all social media. I still use it too, but can you establish clear boundaries when it comes to comparison if you're going to use that tool? And even beyond social media, where do you find yourself maybe sitting on the sidelines at the game comparing your family to others? Or do you listen to stories at the break room at work, wishing that you had what others have? Where can you tame or break some of these negative comparison patterns? Our second application is this: catch yourself when your eyes are fixed on other people. Treat this maybe like a pulse check. Stop and analyze your thought patterns. How much am I thinking about what other people are doing and what other people have right now? Do I detect within myself a disgruntled resentment about someone else? You could even adopt this as a practice of prayer, taking intentional time in prayer regularly to open your hands and release back to God your opinions of other people. Say, God, you are their portion just like you're my portion. And so I'm not going to worry about what you've chosen to give to them. As I learned in a marriage seminar a few years ago, we can draw a circle around ourselves and then focus only on how we can affect and change what's inside the circle, not outside, right? Comparison is going to regularly pull you outside of your own circle, but we can focus on what's inside first and foremost. And finally, guys, create a regular practice of gratitude in your life. Try maybe writing gratitudes down, occasionally reading through them. In our home, we put up a chalkboard. My wife put up a chalkboard in our living room where anytime our boys are tempted to be whiny or complaining about things, we try to redirect them to, let's put up on the chalkboard what we're actually thankful for now. And we read through those. I know it's got some weird stuff on there, like we're thankful for frogs, we're thankful for toilets, but it still does a good thing for us. It's scientifically proven in brain chemistry to boost your dopamine response when you focus on what you're grateful for. And don't forget gratitude even for the trials, for the hard things in life that you've been through or even are still in the midst of, because God is there with you, just like he was with the Hebrew people in the wilderness. And I would say to also do this, you can give yourself exposure to environments with maybe less abundance. because it increases our appreciation for God's incredible blessings. Ultimately, guys and gals, true satisfaction does not come from getting our earthly desires met. And focusing our eyes and our attention on what other people have steals away a mindset of gratitude that would otherwise be producing holy contentment in us. Envy is insidious and it is destructive, but the truth is, nothing is better than our true portion that we've received, which is God himself through his providence of Jesus on the cross. Have you taken part in that? If so, that portion is enough. And if not, we would love to tell you more about that today so that you can feel a contentment in your heart and in your soul with what God has provided for you and still does every day. Would you pray with me? God, we love you and we acknowledge that you are a good God. And in all goodness and grace and wisdom, you have taken care of our very hearts and souls. And you still today are providing everything that we need. God, we acknowledge and we confess before you how easily our hearts turn towards discontent and envy of others. God, we relinquish that right now in this moment, and we commit ourselves to focusing more on a lifestyle of gratitude and contentment instead of fixing our eyes and our hearts and souls on what we don't have and what others do. Lord, we love you. We lift up praise and worship to you today, and we pray these things in Jesus' most holy and precious name. Amen.